Artlist.io. Music licensing reimagined.
I want you to picture a man at the absolute height of his profession. I mean, he is wearing the golden robes, he's walking the halls of power. He's trusted so completely that he serves as the personal confessor to the Greek royal family. He's not just part of the establishment, he's, deep inside the inner circle.
It sounds like the setup for a biography about a very comfortable, very powerful figure in the Greek Orthodox Church.
You would think so. But then you flip the page, and suddenly this same man, Archimandrite Nikodim Tsarknias, is effectively public enemy number one. He's stripped of his title, he's an outcast, and he spends the next 30 years of his life just walking in and out of courtrooms. We are talking about a rap sheet with over 20 trials.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about charges for bank robbery or running some kind of cartel.
No, not at all. He's being charged with things like impersonating a priest, disrupting a religious congregation, and trying to build a church without a permit.
That's a staggering reversal of fortune. And I'm glad we're digging into this because Tsarknias' story is so much more than just one man's legal drama. It is a perfect, if pretty terrifying case study in a concept that human rights organizations call judicial harassment.
That's a heavy term. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, it means using the legal system itself as a weapon. So not to prosecute a crime in the way you'd think like stopping a thief, but to exhaust a person's resources, to destroy their reputation and just grind them down until they give up.
So it's less about their actions and more about who they are.
Exactly. It's about criminalizing their very existence.
And to understand how a royal confessor even ends up in that position, we have to look at where this is all happening. We're heading to northern Greece, specifically the Pella regional unit.
Right. And context is everything here. We aren't talking about some quiet seaside village. This is a border region, a geopolitical fault line. I mean, the identities in this part of the Balkans have been fluid and contested for over a century. You have Greek speakers, you have Macedonian speakers, and a history of borders just moving back and forth.
And Tsarknias is born right in the middle of all this in 1942 in a town called Eridia.
Correct. He's born into an ethnic Macedonian family, but he joins the Greek Orthodox Church as a young man, and he thrives there. He rises to the rank of Archimandrite, which is a very senior monastic priest. He is completely embedded in the Greek institution.
So what changed? I mean, did he just wake up one day and decide to rebel?
It wasn't one day, but there was a massive catalyst.
It was in 1990.
In the Republic of Macedonia, what we now call North Macedonia, declared independence from Yugoslavia. It triggered this huge identity crisis in the region.
Right, the whole name dispute.
Exactly. And there was this huge diplomatic firestorm, and nationalist tensions in Greece just went through the roof.
I remember reading about that. The atmosphere was incredibly charged.
Charged is putting it mildly. And right in the middle of this national panic, Tsarknias decides that this is the moment to stop hiding who he is. He starts openly asserting his Macedonian identity and advocating for the Macedonian-speaking minority in northern Greece.
And I'm guessing that didn't go over too well with his bosses in the church.
It was explosive. In 1992, he was expelled from the Greek Orthodox Church. Now, they didn't write because he's Macedonian on the termination paper.
Of course not.
No. They cited disciplinary issues. But Tsarknias and, pretty much every human rights monitor, including Amnesty International, saw it for what it was, a political purge.
Okay, so he's fired. Usually when a priest gets defrocked, that's it, right? That's the end of the line. You could go find a civilian job. You don't keep saying mass.
Most people would have just faded away.
Yeah.
But Tsarknias did the exact opposite. He joined the Macedonian Orthodox Church, the MOC. And this is where things get really legally complicated.
Because at that time, the MOC was considered schismatic, right?
Precisely.
Meaning the other Orthodox churches just didn't recognize it.
Exactly. To the Greek Church, and by extension the Greek state, the MOC didn't legally exist. It was seen as a kind of rebel organization. So by joining them, Tsarknias wasn't just switching jobs. He was stripping himself of all institutional protection. He became, in the eyes of the state, a civilian pretending to be a priest.
And that distinction, civilian pretending to be a priest, that sounds like the engine behind this entire 30-year legal nightmare.
It is the root of everything. And it starts with a building project. Tsarknias had a lifelong dream to build a church, St. Zlata of Meglin, in his hometown, so that locals could hear the liturgy in their own language.
That sounds simple enough. You buy the land, you apply for a permit, you build the church.
In a normal situation, yes. But here, he ran into what I call the zoning trap. In Greece, to get a permit to build a church, you need authorization from the local ecclesiastical authority.
Wait, you mean the local Greek bishop?
Correct.
The same bishop who just kicked him out and thinks his new church is fake?
The very same one.
That's a rigged game. There is absolutely zero chance he gets that signature.
And he didn't. Tsarknias famously stood up in court and said, "They will never grant this to a Macedonian priest." It was a classic catch-22. You can't build without a permit, and you can't get a permit because of who you are.
So what did he do? Did he try to build it anyway?
Tried, and that's where the judicial harassment really kicks into high gear. He wasn't just stopped. He was criminalized. He was charged with establishing and operating a temple without authorization. In 2004, he was actually sentenced to 3 months in prison for this.
For building a church.
Well, technically for zoning violations,
Mm-hmm.
but this is how the system works. It uses these neutral, bureaucratic laws to enforce ideological control. But honestly, the zoning stuff is mild compared to what came next.
Yeah, I want to get into the specific trials because the sources mention over 20 of them, and some of these charges sound, well, petty, but the consequences were huge. Let's talk about the microphone incident.
This one is just surreal. It happened between 1992 and 1996 in the village of Agios Athanasios. The allegation was that Tsarknias unplugged the microphones during a mass being led by a Greek bishop.
Okay, let's assume for a second he did it. That's rude. Maybe it's disorderly conduct. It sounds like a slap on the wrist, tops.
You would think, but the state treated it as disrupting a religious congregation. And he was originally sentenced to 40 months in prison.
40 months? That's over 3 years. I know people who've committed actual violent assaults who got less time than that for unplugging a cord.
It was eventually reduced to 24 months on appeal, but that initial sentence sends a message, doesn't it? It says, "We are watching you, and we will use the maximum weight of the law against you for the smallest possible infraction."
It feels incredibly disproportionate. But then you have the charge that seems to just haunt him everywhere, impersonating a priest.
This goes right back to that identity issue. Since the Greek state didn't recognize his new church, every single time Tsarknias put on his robes, every time he baptized a child or held a funeral, the prosecutor argued he was committing fraud.
Falsely wearing the robes of a priest.
Exactly.
Can you imagine the psychological toll of that? You wake up, you put on your work clothes, which for him are sacred vestments, and just by doing that, you are committing a crime.
It criminalizes his daily existence.
Yeah.
It's designed to humiliate him. And if the law says you're a fake, it makes it scary for your congregation to follow you. It just delegitimizes you in the eyes of the entire community.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate for a second here. We can talk about zoning and microphones and argue those are political, but there is one charge in the file that is ugly. The assault charge.
Yes, the 2002 case.
He was accused of beating a 12-year-old boy. Now, if a priest hits a kid, that is a crime, period. I don't care what your politics are. Why should we view this as part of the harassment and not just a guy losing his temper?
It's a fair question. And it's the one charge that really threatens to stain his legacy. We have to look at the details Tsarknias provided and the context from, say, Human Rights Watch. Tsarknias claimed he caught the boy vandalizing his home, throwing eggs and stones. He says he merely restrained the child to take him to the police.
So he says it was self-defense against vandalism.
That was his defense. He called the conviction state-sponsored revenge. And here's why human rights groups tend to side with him on this. The timing and the pattern. When you have a state that has already manufactured 20 other trials against a man, suddenly hitting him with a moral turpitude charge like this, it just fits the playbook perfectly. It damages his reputation in a way that zoning violations never could.
It paints him as violent.
Precisely. If you can't get people to hate him for being a schismatic, maybe you can get them to hate him for hurting a child. He was sentenced to 6 months, but the cloud of that accusation, it lingers.
So they came for his building, they came for his title, and they came for his reputation. And then much later, in 2018, it looks like they decided to come for his wallet.
The financial angle. This is the modern way to silence dissent. The Greek Tax Revenue Office in Edessa hit him with a fine of roughly 45,000 euros.
There's a massive amount of money for a local priest. What was their justification?
They claimed he had roughly 57,000 euros in undeclared personal income.
And I'm guessing he didn't exactly see it as personal income?
No. He argued these were donations. The money came from the Macedonian diaspora, People in Canada and Australia sending checks specifically to help build that church we talked about earlier.
But the state treated it like he was just pocketing the cash.
Because they don't recognize his church as a legal entity. So think about it. If a recognized Greek priest gets donations for his parish, that's church money. It's tax exempt. But because Tsarknias is viewed as essentially a private citizen, the state treats those donations as his personal profit.
So he's being taxed like he's a CEO, but he's operating a nonprofit.
Which drains the very resources that are intended to keep the whole movement alive. It's effective. You don't have to put someone in jail to stop them. You just have to bankrupt them.
It feels like he was blocked at every single turn within the Greek system. Did he ever try to go over their heads?
He did. When the domestic courts fail you, you look to Europe. Tsarknias took his case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg.
And this wasn't just some small complaint, right? This became a landmark case, Tsarknias v. Greece.
It was very significant. He challenged the fairness of his trials and the constant interference with his religious duties. And he had a strong precedent to stand on. There was a previous case, Holy Monasteries v. Greece, which established a key principle.
Which was?
That the state cannot arbitrarily interfere with the internal administration of a religious body.
Basically, the government shouldn't be in the business of deciding who is or isn't a real priest.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the ECHR has frequently censured Greece for using very old laws to justify this kind of oppression. Specifically, they point to laws from 1938, the era of the Metaxas dictatorship.
Wait, they are using laws from a pre-WWII dictatorship?
Yes. Laws that were originally designed to control all associations and suppress dissent. The ECHR has ruled that using these laws to require a bishop's permit for a house of worship violates the basic human right to religious freedom.
So Europe is telling Greece, you are breaking the rules. Does that actually change anything on the ground in Pella?
Well, it provides moral vindication. It creates a legal record that he was wronged. But as we've seen, it doesn't always stop the local police from writing a ticket or the local prosecutor from filing a new charge. International law is a very slow ship to turn.
Speaking of turning ships, we have to talk about the plot twist, because if this was a movie, the third act just happened in 2022.
This is huge. For decades, the entire legal argument against Tsarknias was based on the idea that his church, the MOC, was fake. It was schismatic.
Right.
Well, in 2022, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the absolute highest authority in the Orthodox world, and the Serbian Orthodox Church officially recognized the Macedonian Orthodox Church.
Help us understand the magnitude of that. What does that mean?
Okay, think of it like this. Imagine a doctor who has been practicing without a license for 30 years, getting arrested every week for it. And then suddenly the medical board comes out and says, actually, you know what? You were a licensed doctor the whole time.
That changes everything.
It should. If the mother church in Constantinople says you are canonical, you are recognized, then the argument that Tsarknias is an impersonator theoretically just evaporates. You can't be impersonating a priest if you are a priest of a now recognized church.
So did the Greek courts apologize and drop all the charges?
I wish I could tell you that. But bureaucracy is stubborn, and nationalism is even more stubborn. The sources note that despite this massive theological shift, the local Greek courts have been very, very slow to adapt.
They're ignoring the medical board.
Essentially. The hostility remains. They are still finding ways to pressure him, which really suggests that this was never about canon law to begin with. It was always about identity. The theology was just the excuse.
So we have a man in his 80s now. He's spent more time in court than most lawyers. What is the legacy here? Is he just a tragic figure?
I don't think his supporters see him as tragic. I think they see him as victorious because he simply refused to disappear. He became a symbol of resistance.
The sources mention his impact on cultural preservation.
A huge impact. By holding liturgy in Macedonian, by refusing to switch languages, even when he was threatened with jail time, he created a sanctuary for that culture. He proved that you could be Macedonian and Orthodox in Greece, even if the state was telling you it was impossible.
And he also laid the groundwork for other legal battles, right?
Yes, the Solon case, for instance, which fights for the right to register Macedonian cultural clubs. That case stands on the shoulders of Tsarknias' struggle. He showed that you could drag the state all the way to the European court and win, even if the daily cost was excruciating.
It really is a story about the power of being incredibly, undeniably stubborn.
Or devoted. But yes, his stubbornness forced the system to reveal itself. Every time they arrested him for wearing robes, they were just proving his point about discrimination to the rest of the world.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the royal palace to the tax office, from the jail cell all the way to the patriarchate. It's a dense story.
It is, and it's a reminder that religious freedom isn't just about what you believe in your head. It's about whether you have the right to build a building, to wear a uniform, and to speak your language without the government destroying your life.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
What's on your mind?
We talked a lot about legitimacy today. The Greek state said Tsarknias was a fake. The local bishop said he was a fraud. But his congregation, they believed he was real. And eventually, the patriarchate agreed with them. So here's the question. Where does a priest's authority actually come from? Does it come from a government-stamped permit? Does it come from a court ruling, from the hierarchy in Constantinople? Or does it come from the people standing in the pews who choose to follow him?
That is the ultimate question. Because when those four things contradict each other, who gets the final say?
Something to think about. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.